was exactly midnight when Scotland Yard came to break my lock.
You're holding back, Maud. We took the sister into custody this afternoon, but the paperwork has a hole in it I can drive a motorcab through. If you are shielding the real thief, an innocent girl rots in a cell.
I had the evidence that would rewrite the warrant for my own client. I had the truth. And the truth was about to tear Bellevue House to pieces.
From the shadow-drenched cobblestones of a changing city where secrets are buried deep beneath high society prestige and the law is a luxury few can afford. MicroPulse presents Maud West, Private Inquirer. Tonight's dossier, Episode 6, The Inheritance. When the fragile peace of Bellevue House is shattered by a cold, calculating act of betrayal, Maud West finds herself caught in a tightening vice between a client of absolute decency and an innocent soul facing the gallows. Turn back the clock to 1930s London, step inside the dark corridors of the Sterling estate and prepare to open the latest file.
In my line of work, wealth usually wears a rather tedious mask. It is typically arrogant, deeply suspicious, and thoroughly unlikable. The sort of high society rot that treats a private investigator like a necessary piece of plumbing to be hidden beneath the floorboards. So when the prestigious Sterling estate case crossed my desk, shredded in a tangled web of forged ledger signatures and altered inheritance lines, I expected the usual pack of aristocratic wolves. I expected to spend my days nodding politely at sneering old men and calculating exactly how much I could raise my fee to tolerate their presence. Instead, I found Bellevue House. It sat on the fringes of Belgravia, a massive, towering monument to late Victorian opulence that time, and the modern world had quietly begun to forget. The gold leaf on the cornices was peeling away in tiny, glittering flakes. The immense velvet drapes smelled faintly of damp and decades of coal smoke. It was a golden cage, magnificent from a distance, but suffocatingly cold the moment you stepped past the marble threshold. Yet it was the inhabitants of this fading empire that truly threw me off my guard. They were something far more hazardous to a private investigator's professional detachment than any pack of wolves. I found a family I genuinely liked. There were 3 of them left, stranded like castaways on an island of old money that was rapidly drying up. At the helm stood Julian, the eldest brother. He was a man built for a century that had already died, carrying himself with a quiet, heartbreaking grace that felt entirely out of step with the frantic, clattering reality of 1930s London. When he came to my office, his hands didn't shake, but his eyes carried the terrible hollow weight of a man who knew he was the last line of defence between his family name and the public ignominy of bankruptcy. Julian had spent the last 5 years trying to patch the holes in their late father's wildly mismanaged shipping empire. He didn't complain, he didn't point fingers, and he certainly didn't indulge in the usual aristocratic self-pity. He simply stood by the fireplace in that draughty room, staring into the dying embers, as if he could visually reconstruct the vanished fortunes of his house. He was entirely decent, a man of absolute honour, who had been handed a legacy made of smoke and unpaid debts. It was Julian who begged me to investigate the anomalies in the private family ledgers, desperate to find some accounting error, some rogue clerk in the city. Anything that might explain where £50,000 had vanished before the court stepped in to strip the sterling name of its remaining dignity. Then there was Clara. If Julian was the anchor of Bellevue House, Clara was its fragile, beating heart. She was the youngest, a quiet, gentle soul, who seemed to exist entirely on the periphery of the family's anxieties. While her brothers quarrelled over shipping manifests and bank drafts, Clara spent her mornings in the walled estate garden, tending to pale winter roses, or sat by the tall parlour windows watching the London rain paint long, grey streaks across the glass. There was an innocence to her that felt almost miraculous given the cynical nature of the city outside. She possessed a rare, quiet grace that made the cold, suffocating walls of that mansion feel almost human. She didn't understand the complex machinery of finance. She only knew that her brothers were unhappy, that the house was growing colder, and that the long, hushed whispers behind closed library doors boded no good for any of them. I found myself watching her during my time at the estate, realising that if this house fell, it would be Clara who broke first. She was entirely defenceless against the sharp, jagged edges of the world. The final piece of the sterling triad was Arthur, the middle brother. Where Julian was stone, Arthur was glass, sharp, brittle, and constantly reflecting his own bitterness. He was a creature of London's more fashionable, less respectable clubs, the sort that don't appear in any directory, returning to Bellevue House only to demand more capital from an estate that was already bleeding to death. The friction between the brothers was a palpable thing, a thick, sour fog that filled the corridors whenever they occupied the same room. Arthur resented Julian's authority. Julian despaired of Arthur's extravagance. Yet, despite the cracks in the foundation, they were a family. They bound themselves together against the outside world, presenting a united, if fragile, front to the bankers and lawyers who circled Bellevue House like crows over a battlefield. It was a delicate ecosystem, balanced on a knife edge, and my presence was the catalyst that would inevitably upset that balance. Because fraud of this magnitude doesn't simply remain behind closed mansion doors. When hundreds of thousands of pounds vanish from a prominent London estate, the Crown takes a rather sharp, unyielding notice. Which is precisely how Scotland Yard found their way to the perimeter. Inspector Flynn had been assigned to the official, public side of the Sterling investigation, weeks before I was quietly retained by Julian. The city banks had flagged the irregular movements of capital across the Channel, and Flynn was the man chosen to untangle the knot, while I was sitting in the fading warmth of the Bellevue parlour, picking through private diaries and family ledgers. Flynn was pounding the pavements of the financial district, tracking the bank drafts as they moved like phantoms through the counting houses of London. Our paths had only crossed a few times over the last few months, but it was already enough for a quiet, professional respect to take root between us. He was a creature of the law, bound by systemic red tape, while I was an independent variable who could slip into the spaces the Yard couldn't touch. We were still measuring each other's strides, completely blind to how quickly this case was about to force us into the exact same corner. Paper doesn't lie, but it can be made to perform a magnificent, terrifying masquerade if the hand guiding the pen is clever enough. For 3 days, I lived under the lens in my own office, turning my back on the grand tragedy of Bellevue House to focus entirely on the cold, black and white reality of ink. I matched international bank transfer logs against the family's private archives, tracking every shilling that had left the estate over the last 24 months. I didn't want the culprit to be a sterling. I told myself that a private detective has no room for sentiment, but the truth is, I was desperate to find an outsider. I hunted for a rogue accountant with a gambling habit, a bitter family solicitor who had spent years lining his pockets, anyone who didn't share the bloodline, anyone whose ruin wouldn't tear that fragile house apart. But the deeper I dug into the missing thousands, the more the ink bled inward. The fraud wasn't executed from the busy offices of the city. It was done from the inside. It was born within the very rooms where I had been served tea. And then the trap snapped shut. every altered signature on the transfer authorizations, every forged letter sent to the London and Westminster Bank, every unaccounted withdrawal slip. None of them pointed to a complex network of phantom thieves. They pointed directly, undeniably, to Clara. The evidence was staggering in its completeness. There were private letters written in her distinct, elegant script, detailing instructions to move funds into an offshore account in Amsterdam. There were ledger entries in her personal notebook that perfectly mirrored the missing amounts down to the last penny. Paper doesn't lie, but it can be made to perform a magnificent, terrifying masquerade if the hand guiding the pen is clever enough. For 3 days, I lived under the lens in my own office, turning my back on the grand tragedy of Bellevue House to focus entirely on the cold, black and white reality of ink. I matched international bank transfer logs against the family's private archives, tracking every shilling that had left the estate over the last 24 months. I didn't want the culprit to be a sterling. I told myself that a private detective has no room for sentiment, but the truth is, I was desperate to find an outsider. I hunted for a rogue accountant with a gambling habit, a bitter family solicitor who had spent years lining his pockets, anyone who didn't share the bloodline, anyone whose ruin wouldn't tear that fragile house apart. But the deeper I dug into the missing thousands, the more the ink bled inward. The fraud wasn't executed from the busy offices of the city. It was done from the inside. It was born within the very rooms where I had been served tea. And then the trap snapped shut. Every altered signature on the transfer authorizations, every forged letter sent to the London and Westminster Bank, every unaccounted withdrawal slip. None of them pointed to a complex network of phantom thieves. They pointed directly, undeniably, to Clara. The evidence was staggering in its completeness. There were private letters written in her distinct, elegant script, detailing instructions to move funds into an offshore account in Amsterdam. There were ledger entries in her personal notebook that perfectly mirrored the missing amounts down to the last penny. To anyone else, to a jury of shopkeepers, to the stern judges at the Old Bailey, to the clinical minds at Scotland Yard, the paperwork was an airtight case. Clara Sterling looked like a cold, calculating embezzler who had systematically, ruthlessly bled her family dry while pretending to tend to her roses. It was a masterpiece of destruction. But fraud is an art form, and I have spent too many years looking at bad paintings not to recognise when a brushstroke is entirely unnatural. Clara hadn't the malice, let alone the access, to move that kind of capital through the international markets. She didn't even know how to cross-reference a bank statement. Someone had meticulously, beautifully laid a breadcrumb trail straight to her door. It was a perfect frame, designed to absorb the total weight of the crime and leave the real thief walking free in the daylight. And the worst part, the evidence was so flawlessly constructed, the law wouldn't care a damn about the difference between reality and the ink on the page. To anyone else, to a jury of shopkeepers, to the stern judges at the Old Bailey, to the clinical minds at Scotland Yard, the paperwork was an airtight case. Clara Sterling looked like a cold, calculating embezzler who had systematically, ruthlessly bled her family dry while pretending to tend to her roses. It was a masterpiece of destruction. But fraud is an art form, and I have spent too many years looking at bad paintings not to recognise when a brushstroke is entirely unnatural. Clara hadn't the malice, let alone the access, to move that kind of capital through the international markets. She didn't even know how to cross-reference a bank statement. Someone had meticulously, beautifully laid a breadcrumb trail straight to her door. It was a perfect frame, designed to absorb the total weight of the crime and leave the real thief walking free in the daylight. And the worst part? The evidence was so flawlessly constructed, the law wouldn't care a damn about the difference between reality and the ink on the page.
You are listening to Maud West, Private Inquirer, on MicroPulse, presenting tonight's chronicle, The Inheritance. The trap has snapped shut on Bellevue House, but as the storm rages over the city, the real game is just beginning. Before the clock strikes midnight, take a moment to seal your place in our investigative circle. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like on this file, and help us expand the archive for independent theatre. We return now to Maud's quiet office, where the grandfather clock strikes 12.
It took me another 12 grueling hours to find the single flaw in the masterpiece. The one overlapping ledger entry that the architect of this ruin forgot to scrub from the master record. It was a small thing, a transfer date, that fell while Clara was confirmed to be bedridden with influenza. Verified by a physician's log I had quietly slipped from the house during my initial survey of the estate. And that was when the vice truly tightened around my throat. The evidence didn't point away from the family. It pointed back to the architect who had built the frame. It was Julian. The realization hit me like a physical blow in the quiet of my office. The honourable, decent brother, the anchor of Bellevue House, was the thief. He had moved the money out of a desperate, reckless gamble to save the family shipping lines from a hidden debt he couldn't control, never intending for the blame to fall on his sister. But when Scotland Yard began to circle, panic must have set in. He had altered the records, shifting the paper trail onto Clara's unread ledgers, thinking the police would never look too closely at the innocent sister, or perhaps planning to confess before she was ever truly endangered. But intent is a luxury the gallows do not recognise. The law does not balance a man's noble motives against the forgery on his pen. So I found myself stranded at a rather ugly, isolated crossroads. Protect my client, the man who had come to me in his finest hour of misery, the man whose honour I had respected, or protect an innocent girl framed by a system that would hang her without a second thought. The professional handbook says you hand the files over to the authorities, send your invoice to the estate, and walk away with your conscience intact. But I've never had much use for handbooks. I took the single damning document that could destroy Clara, and the one document that proved Julian's hand guided the forgery, slid it into the deep recess of my mahogany desk drawer, and turned the brass key. I was sitting on evidence. It was a dangerous, felonious game, but a necessary one. But I entirely underestimated the speed of the Yard, and the desperate greed of the middle brother. While I sat in my office, calculating how to save Clara, Arthur had taken a match to the fuse, desperate to squeeze capital from the estate to cover his debts, the sort run up in clubs that don't appear in any directory. Arthur had stolen a copy of the family bank files and handed them to a high society lawyer to force a liquidation. He thought he was playing a clever game of blackmail. Instead, the lawyer panicked and flagged the Crown.
The call from the commissioner came down at 3:30. By 4 o'clock, I had a squad of uniformed bobbies marching past the grand velvet drapes of Bellevue House. The paperwork the lawyer handed us was a meticulous breadcrumb trail, and every single scrap of ink pointed straight to the youngest sister. I didn't like it. In my line of work, when a case drops into your lap looking that polished, someone usually spent a great deal of time making it shine. But the law doesn't care for a detective's instinct. It cares about the warrant. We took Clara Sterling into custody right in front of her brothers and locked her in a cold holding cell at Bow Street. It wasn't until 6 o'clock, sitting alone under the harsh glare of my desk lamp at the Yard, that the polished frame began to crack. I was cross-referencing the transfer logs Arthur had stolen against the master timeline of the shipping ledger. That was when I saw the void. A 3-day gap where £20,000 had vanished. completely unaccounted for in the official file, perfectly scrubbed right before my arrival. Someone had been inside those books before us. Someone with an extraordinarily sharp eye and a total disregard for police procedure had excised the missing link to protect a player. I knew her handwriting, and I knew the shape of her thinking, and it was everywhere in those ledgers. Maud West. She wasn't just investigating the Sterling estate, she was managing it. A wave of irritation hit me, followed by something far more dangerous. A quiet, heavy anxiety for what the commissioner would do to her if my men found that paper first. I didn't call for a transport wagon, and I didn't log the discrepancy. I grabbed my trench coat, stepped out into the pouring rain, and headed for her office. It was time to break her lock.
When the news of the arrest finally reached me, the pieces fell into place with a horrifying click. Flynn hadn't just made an arrest. He had found the missing link I left behind. He knew there was a second player, and he knew I was the one shielding them. And that is why he didn't wait for morning. The door swung open with a heavy, groaning protest against the frame, bringing the cold, damp air of the London streets right into my room. Flynn stood there, a great dark shadow under the brim of his wet fedora, rainwater dripping from the hem of his trench coat onto my floorboards. But he didn't storm in with a warrant or a squad of uniformed bobbies. Given how fresh our acquaintance was, how little we actually owed each other, he should have broken my lock and dragged me to a cell. Instead, he came alone. He had come to ask, not to command. It was the first real sign of a trust he hadn't yet spoken aloud. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him, and dropped his notebook onto the mahogany desk with a dull, heavy thud.
You're holding back, Maud. We took Clara Sterling in this afternoon because the papers Arthur brought to light point straight to her. But the timelines don't square with the arrest. There is a hole in the record, and the only person in this city who could have bridged that gap is sitting in this chair. Give me the missing ledger piece. Don't make me look for it. If you are shielding the real thief, you are letting an innocent girl rot in a stone cell.
I sat perfectly still under the low amber glow of my lamp, reaching into my pocket. I didn't say a word as I slid the brass key across the wood, unlocking the desk drawer. I pulled out the missing ledger page, the one showing Julian's distinct handwriting matching the forgery dates, and laid it flat between us under the lamplight. Clara is a lamb, Inspector. This is the wolf that built the pen. It was Julian all along. Flynn leaned forward, his hands resting on the edge of my desk, staring down at the ink that changed everything. The realization hit him hard. He had the right family, but the wrong sibling in handcuffs. The arrest warrant would have to be rewritten for my own client.
I deal in facts, Maud. If you had given me this 4 hours ago, Clara wouldn't be sitting in a stone cell tonight.
If I had given it to you 4 hours ago, you would have hanged Julian without looking at the debt that drove him to it, and the real truth would have been buried with him. The confrontation broke, but the night didn't follow it out the door. The immediate crisis was resolved. Flynn had the truth, and Julian's arrest was now an inevitability for the morning. But the inspector didn't rush back to the yard to file the paperwork. He stayed. He pulled up the worn leather chair opposite my desk, took off his wet hat, and let out a long, ragged breath that seemed to carry the exhaustion of every dark alley in London. I reached into my cabinet, pulled out a bottle of single malt and poured 2 measures into the crystal glasses. We didn't talk of old cases. We didn't exchange the comfortable, easy banter of old companions. The air between us was far too thick for that. Instead, for a full hour, We sat in a heavy, highly guarded silence. The sort of quiet that exists between two people who realise they have accidentally shown each other the unguarded places beneath their armour. We spoke only in small, fractured sentences, discussing the cold mechanics of Julian's impending morning arrest. But it was the space between the words that felt entirely different. The way his eyes lingered a fraction of a second too long when I handed him his glass. The way the amber lamplight caught the sharp line of his jaw as he stared into his drink. A truce forged not in shared secrets, but in a sudden, terrifying mutual respect. By the time the grandfather clock chimed 1 in the morning, the glasses were empty, the fire was nothing but grey ash, and the trajectory of our brief acquaintance had fundamentally shifted. Flynn stood up, the wet leather of his trench coat heavy in the quiet room. He didn't say, "Thank you." We weren't a pair to exchange unearned pleasantries. Instead, his large, weathered hand reached down and gathered up the forensic findings. The ledger pages, the ink analysis, the timeline that would undo his afternoon mistake. He slid the file safely inside his coat, his eyes locking onto mine one last time from beneath the brim of his hat. A silent acknowledgement passed between us. The case was his now, and I was letting it go. He left as quietly as he had arrived, turning his coat collar up against the relentless damp of the London night. Julian would face the music at dawn, and Clara would be released by noon. Arthur would be left entirely alone in that drafty mansion, inheriting nothing but the cold ash of a family name he had helped destroy, the sole occupant of a golden cage with no gold left in it. Long after Flynn's silhouette had vanished into the thick yellow fog of the street below, I remained standing by the window. I stood there for far longer than I cared to admit, my forehead pressed against the cold, wet glass, watching the empty cobblestones where he had walked. In our line of work, you learn to value the moments when someone else steps into the dark beside you. Until the next inquiry, I remain Maud West, private inquirer, amateur philosopher, reluctant optimist.
You have been listening to MicroPulse's presentation of Maud West, private inquirer in The Inheritance. If you wish to uncover more forgotten secrets from our historical archives, be sure to hit that subscribe button, leave your thoughts in the ledger below, and support an independent creator. Join us next time for the next case file, when a fresh knock on the office door plunges Maud right back into the shadow-drenched corridors of the London underworld, where the truth is always a dangerous commodity. Click right here on your screen to step directly into the next file, and we will see you in the archive.